how do I go back? Right there.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making it to this presentation. I was kind of confused when I walked into a big room. I expected to be in a very small room. I thought I was in a wrong room, but here we are. So today I'm going to talk about the process of the report card development for India. I'm an associate professor at the University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan. I'm in the School of Public Policy. Our focus more and more has been towards active living policy as part of my lab. I remember declaring my conflict of interest when I submitted the abstract. I didn't put in a slide there, but I'd like to say that there's no conflict of interest for this work. This started as a voluntary work, but my lab is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, Lawson Foundation, and the SPORE networks. So why? I think that's a big question. I'm in Canada. I'm talking about the India report cards. Why are we doing this? Well, the obvious is the rising prevalence of non-communicable diseases. We do live in a globalized world. So it's sort of global health in a globalized world. That's how I look at it. So that's one of the big reasons for starting this work. The other is India's youth is projected to be a major proportion of the world's workforce. So there is an economic argument for doing this work. You know, measurement and evaluation of active living in India has implications for the world economy. So that's another big one. But from a research perspective, there's been very minimal focus on children and youth active living research in India. There's been more focus on adults. And finally, probably the most important reason where the advocacy piece comes into play is we do develop recommendations for action as part of these report cards. So that kind of encapsulates of why we're doing this work. There are so many academics in the room, as you know. We are on tenure track. We struggle to do our work, but why am I doing this voluntary work? So this is a reason why we started this work. This work is part of Global Matrix 3.0. It started as 1.0, 2.0, it's 3.0 now. It's out of the Active Healthy Kids Global Alliance. Mark Tremblay, I think he's going to be here tomorrow. He's been instrumental in starting this work, and he got me involved in Global Matrix. So the India report card is part of 49 other countries who developed their report cards. So there's cross-country translation of knowledge. So that's the big impact of this, where the middle-income countries can learn from low-income countries, the low-income countries can learn from high-income countries. So that's the big picture of how these report cards are situated. As part of this work, we started a non-governmental organization in India called Active Healthy Kids India. The main purpose of the organization being to put together a group of researchers across India who could work with us from Canada. So this is a Canadian-Indian group at the moment, and I spend quite a few evenings late into the night because of the 12-hour time difference while I'm doing this work. So you can imagine how tricky it is working with a group in a country like India. But you know, we've had a fairly good success, and we've had 2 report cards so far. I'll talk about them in a minute. But I keep saying report cards and report cards. What are the report cards all about? The report cards are about the physical activity for children and youth, and we look at a range of indicators from behaviors to context, such as built environment, to government policies, and we grade them based on a standardized rubric. So because we are using a standardized rubric such as this one, we can compare the grades across countries. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second when I say across countries. India is the second most populous nation in the world. It's going to be the most populous nation in the world in 3 or 4 years. That's the projection. There are 1.3 billion people in India. A small city in India is 2 million. So you can imagine the difficulty in getting evidence in such a big country. More than 20 official languages. So it's quite tricky getting this evidence, but we started from scratch, and that was the first report card which came out in 2016. As you can see, there were quite a few incomplete grades because there was very little evidence to grade indicators on. So that was 2016. We spent quite a bit of time from 2016 to 2018, and you could see we filled in some of the gaps. And I see a few incomplete grades yet. One for organized sport participation, the other for school infrastructure. My God, the number of schools in India, they go into hundreds of thousands. So it's very difficult to get data from across different schools. Imagine the number of school divisions, different types of schools. So that's why that work is incomplete. And owing to my partners in India, we had to put in the indicator for yoga because there's a strong feeling in the country that there's cultural appropriation of yoga everywhere in the West. So we put in the indicator for yoga, and now we're going forward and getting the data about yoga. So in the end, we came up with these recommendations, which range from investments in active living policy and research to a national strategy. One thing that is really important to me is gender-based inequities. There are special sort of considerations in a country like India with cultural implications for gender. There's a bit of patriarchy we have to deal with. So there's a big gap between especially boys and girls in terms of active living. So anyway, we came up with these recommendations. And how do we go forward with this? I mean, the big thing was getting data. How do we get data from such a large country? So we're doing this sort of a platform called SMART. It's a mobile health and citizen science platform where we are engaging citizens through their smartphones to get data from them directly. Now, it works very well for 13 to 18-year-old kids. It's a very tricky situation getting ethics for 7 to 12, but we are getting some good data using this platform. This was the first paper that came out of the platform in 2018. This was based on a pilot conducted in adults in Canada, but the platform has expanded to youth. So we have a number of studies going on right now where we collect data using objective as well as subjective measures through smartphones. Now, the smartphone penetration is pretty high in a country like India, just like here. The data is very cheap. So it made logistical sense in getting data directly from citizens. So that's the work we are doing. And out of the number of studies we are conducting, Smart India is one of the studies. There are other studies which range from Smart Youth, Smart Indigenous Youth, to Smart Response, where we are engaging youth in real time to address risks of physical inactivity and even mental health. So through Smart India, we are working with groups in 3 big cities in India. So Chennai and Delhi, populations close to 20 million. Mysuru, close to 10 million. So you can imagine, getting a representative population sample from those groups. Most of this work is being conducted through my lab, which is called the Depth Lab, which is based at the University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan. And we are looking forward to filling those gaps, those 3 incompletes that we had in the indicator grading. We hope to fill those by 2020 or 2021. So that's the work we're doing and the good part is there is some exchange of knowledge and exchange of even scholars between Canada and India while we're doing this work. So that's my presentation for today. If you have any questions later, you can send an email to one of those email addresses on the screen. Thank you. I'll take any questions if you have any questions. Okay, I can't see you very well because of the lights, but yeah.
Hi. This is phenomenally designed. Like the wealth of information that you gather is going to be not just broad, but very not granular. It's going to be very refined and very a lot of sort of individual level data. Do you think that is there a selection bias introduced here in terms of the number of? You don't even have to look at me. I feel bad for you looking into that light.
I would like to look at you so I kind of get a perspective.
Yeah, no worries.
Of who I'm talking to.
Is there a selection bias in terms of the people in India who have mobile phones? I mean, isn't someone who has a mobile phone, are they not just more likely to be wealthier, perhaps less active? Like, what is the demographic? Who are you capturing?
No, that's actually an interesting misconception.
Yeah.
My parents still live in India.
Yeah.
I visit there maybe once a year, once every 2 years.
Yeah.
The penetration of mobile phones is incredible.
Yeah.
It's across demographics.
Okay.
And not just mobile phones. I mean, I look at mobile phones as tools of equity, but the real issue of equity is access to internet.
Yeah.
Whatever your political inclinations are with Facebook, because of these companies, there's a lot of free data.
Yeah.
And when we do these studies, one of our apps uses only Wi-Fi data, but there's a potential for you to lose some of your data as you're participating in these studies. With data being so freely available in the developing countries, it's a means to directly engage citizens.
Okay.
So the methodology that I support or I use is an integration of citizen science, community-based participatory research, and system science, which is big data. And we are getting big data through smartphones. It's not just subjective data, but it's also objective data through sensors.
Yeah.
So.
And how do people consent to this? Like.
So if you download an app that we use, a customized app that we use, you provide informed consent through the app itself.
And how are you promoting the app?
So it's a very good question. I feel that, okay, how much time do we have? So citizen science came out of environmental science.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to use that for public health or population health research, which is more passive citizen science. It was less of activism and more passive citizen science. Yeah. So in order for you to have that compliance, you have to engage with partners on the ground. So if you're working with schools, you need to get the schools on board for someone to download the app, and so that your compliance rates are high. Yeah. With adults, crowdsourcing might work, but it hasn't in my experience. It always comes down to some partner at the local level. So if I'm working with a school here in Canada, the champion would be the school division or the schools or the school principals.
Got it.
And of course, there's incentives like free data, which I try to push, but it's not so easy in Canada, much easier in India.
Got it. Okay, that's really interesting.
Denis Prudhomme, U-Ottawa, and Institut Savoir Montfort. Thank you for a great presentation. Could you give us a list or a range of what type of data that you could capture?
Okay. So how many of you are interested in subjective data? Subjective survey data. So we're coming out with a paper which is comparing IPAC with an ecological momentary assessment. And don't hate me for getting that paper out. There's huge differences in how we recall what we did today and what we did for the past 1 week. So that's a big thing about ecological momentary assessments. So we are getting data on the go, which is daily recalls as well as momentary recalls. That's subjective. That's an example of subjective data, which you could capture physical activity, other sorts of behaviors as well, screen time. The data that fascinates me is the objective data, sensor data, screen state. Every time you pick up your screen, you could record it. Apple collects the data, but it doesn't give it to us. So we are working on a methodology to derive objective screen state data. GPS data, Wi-Fi, accelerometry, pedometry. So that's an example of objective data we are collecting, and the rate at which we are collecting is 5 seconds. So you can imagine, even if someone you download the app and you forget about it, and you have it in your pocket for a week, you get a lot of data for 8 days. So that's where the big data piece comes into play. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So next up we have Dr. Reid, who will talk to us about differences in physical activity by sex and body weight status on school days in school children.
This way forward?
Yeah, that's forward.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Everyone in the back? So I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I think everyone sort of agrees that childhood overweight and obesity is a major health concern in Canada, with now about 26% of that population showing up in those categories. And this is important not only during childhood, when these kids are living at an elevated risk of cardiometabolic disease, but also because these children are more likely to become adults living with obesity and advanced stages of those cardiometabolic outcomes. Now, one way of trying to treat this issue is through physical activity, and we have recommendations for this. So we recommend at least 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity for youth aged 5 to 17 years old. But again, preaching to the choir, I think everyone knows that very few children actually are able to attain these guidelines. So in this study, we wanted to look a little bit at the school environment. One of the main reasons for this is because the elementary school environment basically takes up 75% of the calendar year for children, spending upwards of 6 to 7 hours per day in that environment, and those are waking hours. So this really identifies school time as an important area to help promote MVPA, especially if it's scheduled effectively. And that's what we'll talk about today, is if we can try and schedule that effectively. So the purpose is to describe the timing of physical activity for boys and girls on school days, so the relative distribution of when they're being active. And a secondary aim is to determine if patterns of physical activity vary based on children's BMI category. For this study, we're using data collected from the quality cohort out of St. Justine Hospital. And this includes boys and girls ages 8 to 11 years old. In this study, we measured height, weight, and then derived body mass index, and then using World Health Organization age and sex-specific cutoff points, took those participants and put them into normal weight, overweight, and with obesity categories. All participants in this study wore an actigraphic accelerometer at the waist. They wore it for 7 consecutive days, but we're only looking at school daytime. They were asked to remove it for bathing, other aquatic activities, as well as sleep time. A valid day was at least 10 hours of wear time per day, but our minimum was actually much closer to 16, 17 hours. And we needed at least 3 valid school days to include them in the data set. And our variable of interest was MVPA. So this is kind of important, and I'll come back to it once we get into the outcomes. We took that school day period and we divided it into some relevant time periods. So we have before school, 5 a.m., which was oddly enough a wake-up time for kids that young, to before school, so that was a 3-hour period. Morning class, which was 8 a.m. to noon. The lunch hour, which was 12 noon to 1 p.m. Afternoon class, which was 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And after-school period, which was 3 p.m. all the way to midnight, because, again, a lot of the children were actually still awake, closing in on midnight. So we had 413 participants in this study. We separated them, like I said, into normal weight, overweight, and with obesity, and separated also by sex. Average age was about 10 years, and there was no difference in age or BMI Z-score between sexes within each BMI category. In Table 2, what we're looking at here is the total day physical activity and percentage of children meeting guidelines on school days. What we're seeing is that normal weight boys, do I have a pointer? Maybe, yes. So what we're seeing here is normal weight boys are actually getting quite a bit of MVPA in, so that's 72 minutes of MVPA, with 68% of those children actually meeting MVPA guidelines. Girls, quite a bit lower, statistically lower at 45 minutes. And then when we look at overweight and obese, the trend between boys and girls stays pretty similar, and the numbers just keep getting smaller. So this is the part that may be more interesting to everybody. So this is, again, that total minutes of MVPA, but now we're separating it into those relevant time periods that we discussed earlier. So the first thing we notice is that when we're looking at sex differences within a BMI category, that normal weight boys are more active than normal weight girls across all of those periods. When we look at overweight, we see that it's almost the same, but now before school is similar between boys with overweight and girls with overweight. And then what's sort of interesting is when we get to boys with obesity versus girls with obesity, they're actually very similar across almost all periods, with only the morning class being different between them. And then when we look within sexes across BMI categories, we see that boys with obesity are significantly less active than normal weight boys across essentially the entire day, so almost all periods except for before school. And then with girls, we see no difference between those BMI categories. So similar regardless of normal weight, overweight, or with obesity. When we look at figure 2, what we're looking at here is the percentage. So this is the relative distribution. So rather than the absolute, which we had before, we're seeing here the percentage of the total daily physical activity within each of those categories. So again, when we're looking at the between sex differences within normal weight, we see that a lot of the differences we noticed with the absolute numbers have sort of disappeared, now only identifying differences for normal weight boys versus normal weight girls at the lunch hour and after school. And that's it. There are no differences for overweight. There are no differences for obesity. And when we look at within sexes across BMI categories, there are no differences. So once you go into a relative point, a lot of those differences you saw in the absolute tend to disappear. So coming back to this slide, so we're talking about all these different categories, but before school is 3 hours, morning class is 4 hours, lunch is 1 hour. You're sort of comparing apples and oranges because they're just different time periods. So what we've done is attempt to normalize that and look at sort of an efficiency score within each category. So we took the relative data for each period and then divided that by the number of hours in each period. So essentially, I think we had about 37% in that category before after school for normal weight boys. Divide that by that 9-hour period, you get about 4.2% per hour. So it's sort of a measure of efficiency. So we see, again, not a lot happening. We see a difference between normal weight boys and normal weight girls in terms of their physical activity efficiency at lunch hour, but nothing else for normal weight, overweight, or obesity, and the same thing when you're comparing across BMI categories for each sex. But I want everyone to try and take away from, and might come up in some questions, is that the lunch hour seems to be very efficient in terms of its amount of physical activity that's going on. We see that you're getting about 14.3%. Sorry, I think we're looking at different slides. There we go. Is that better for everybody? So we're seeing here about 14.3% of the total daily physical activity per hour. So that's a very efficient time period, and that could be because of a lot of reasons associated with physical activity during lunchtime. So anyways, summary and conclusions. Boys with obesity do engage in less MVPA compared to normal weight boys on school days. All girls engage in similar MVPA regardless of their BMI category on school days. In essence, obesity does not really seem to influence when children are active on school days, but does have an influence on the absolute levels that we're seeing. And then our final conclusion essentially is that lunch hour on school days is very efficient in terms of promoting physical activity. And if you look at the numbers, if you were to apply that level of efficiency to just 1 hour in the after-school period, you would actually move almost everyone in all BMI categories, regardless of sex, into an area where they're all achieving MVPA guidelines. So essentially, we need to find a way to move that level of efficiency, those factors that are going on at lunch hour, and push them to at least 1 hour after school as well. Future directions, so we're looking at school days specifically, very structured environment. So the next step will be looking at less structured time. So weekend days, summer weekdays, when children have a bit more influence over what they're choosing to do and when they're choosing to do it, as well as potentially the interaction between physical activity and nutrition, considering we're talking about weight management and obesity. I'd like to acknowledge the quality study, of course, the participants and the collaborators, our lab at Universite of Montreal, as well as St. Justin Foundation for my postdoctoral fellowship. And thank you all very much for your time.
Are there any questions?
I think I see one coming.
Yes, one coming. I can't see the light. That's the problem.
Thanks, Manuel from Heart and Stroke. Question about why there there wasn't a difference between normal weight and obese girls in terms of activity versus the boys. And I'm just wondering, is there a kind of a sports type, I wouldn't say stigma, but maybe bias that occurs within the boys, and they, yeah, you know what I'm getting at. I'm not
Yep.
using my words properly here, but
So there definitely is some research showing that there's a sort of a stigma in the school environment and just in a physical activity arena around girls compared to boys. So I wouldn't be able to give a lot of examples off the top of my head, but there is definitely a stigma surrounding it where girls aren't necessarily promoted to do as much physical activity as boys, especially at that young age. Not sure if that answers your question.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So the next, well, Francine is not here, right? Sorry. Oh, you are here? Yeah. Sorry. All right, so up next we have Dr. Francine Dark, who will talk to us about trauma and violence-informed physical activity and obesity prevention programming. So, welcome.
And how does this work?
So the large button moves it forward. and this
Okay.
moves it back.
Okay. Well, thank you all for sticking around. I think our presentation will be slightly different than the first two. So my name is Francine Dark. I am a community-based participatory researcher, and I am just wrapping up my postdoc at UBC. And as a community-based researcher, part of our goal is to always include either our community partner or participants in our programming to present with us. So I have Jessica Webb presenting with me today.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. My name is Jessica Webb. I'm an Aboriginal infant development consultant. I work at Crabtree Corner in Vancouver's downtown east side. The downtown east side in Vancouver is notorious for a lot of things, including overrepresentation in homelessness, poverty, addiction, and survival level street work. Sex work, and but what doesn't, it's known as the poorest postal code in Canada, but what doesn't get acknowledged often is how many mothers and children are living and growing their families in the neighborhood.
So this research was mixed methods. So we had a number of quantitative surveys that the women completed, and our main focus was on the qualitative interview piece. We also used an intersectional theoretical lens to really examine how all various number of factors impact women's daily lives and ultimately their physical activity and weight gain. So this study has been in the works for about 3 years, and we had 3 key phases. So the first one was really understanding the community needs in the downtown east side for pregnant and parenting women. So we ran a number of focus groups. We had over 40 women take part, and we had key informant interviews, and we did an environmental scan to see what physical activity programs were being offered for pregnant and parenting women, and there were none. And we heard loud and clear from the women that they wanted to be physically active, but the existing programs did not meet their needs, their specific needs. So from here, we ran a pilot study, which is essentially a walking program from our partner organization. And we were able to receive donations of shoes and different gear because a lot of the women didn't have access to basic fitness needs. And then we were fortunate to receive some funding, and we scaled up our community-developed intervention, which was Taking Steps, Warrior Women's Wellness.
So the program has three big components. One is our weekly walking program, and I would say this is the bread and butter of the group. Through our funding, we've been able to provide the women with new Nike shoes, new sports bras, things like socks and underwear, and women get a $10 gift card for a grocery store, and every 3 times they come, and we provide bus tickets. In addition to that, the women said they wanted to try different activities, so we facilitate monthly introductions to a new activity where we provide on-site childminding. So we've tried yoga, powwow boot camp, hip-hop dancing, boxing, hiking, soccer. Yeah.
So this work is really grounded in a trauma and violence informed approach to care. So the original model that we used came from healthcare and emergency room settings, which was essentially to provide more appropriate and relevant care to people. So we wanted to take that model and apply it to the physical activity world.
So the first one being trauma awareness. So just acknowledging that if you're working with people, you're probably working with trauma. And there is no one-size-fits-all approach to how you provide services. People handle and experience trauma differently, so their way of moving through the world is going to be similar. Emphasis on safety. All of our women have really kind of intricate histories with violence, and for our women, going as a group out on our walks into the community and trying things as a group is a way of doing that. The importance of choice and collaboration. Immobilization is often an outcome of trauma, so providing this program is totally led and constructed by the women, so providing them with choice really allows them and actually has been able to get them moving. And finally, a strength-based approach. As one of our moms said, when she stopped using, she didn't know who she was or what she liked or what she didn't like. So what we really need to do is meet people where they're at, and that can mean anything, sometimes just celebrating that they made it for the last 15 minutes of the class.
So we had 4 key assessment points. So we are at 1 year of our community developed intervention. And as Jessica mentioned, we had a community advisory board that essentially decided on all of the activities, when they would be delivered, how they would be delivered, and also really guided the research process because we didn't want to potentially trigger anybody by asking inappropriate questions. So the study or the research component of our work, we have 34 women that started. And I should note that we've had over 80 women take part in various aspects of the program, but these are women that only wanted to take part in the research part of that. So we've had fairly good retention rates considering the life circumstances of the women and the precarious housing situations that they're living in.
So 94% of the women identify as being a current substance user or a former substance user. 26% reported spending at least 1 night in a shelter within the last 12 months. All of the women have histories of trauma, and all of the women who identified as Indigenous identified that one of their immediate family members attended residential schools. And we want to note that we believe the women to be 100% resilient, amazing, brilliant.
So just like thinking overall about the population of women we work with, they experience numerous barriers to healthy pregnancies and physical activity. And it's quite complex. And we feel that physical activity and obesity interventions often neglect the real lived experiences of women in particular, and often fail to address the social determinants of health. So again, when we're working with a population like the women that we are working with, things need to be tailored to meet their needs.
So our clients are often coming out of addiction, and their health concerns are kind of popping or being addressed now. And they're often always told to get active, try yoga, try meditation, but these things are very challenging to do on your own. And especially in this population, they need a program and services that are accessible to them.
So just some recommendations that we have from our work and what we've learned. We argue that all physical activity programs and even research should really be trauma informed. And we've found that a trauma and violence informed approach to physical activity can really enhance access to physical activity programs, but also the experiences that people have while they're participating in them. And ultimately, all people should feel safe in accessing and taking part in physical activity, because we want to ultimately create equitable opportunities. So some strengths, what we would say is that we've reached over 80 women who are living in the most marginalizing conditions in Canada, so we think that's pretty great that we've had that much engagement from women and sustained engagement from them. We've also been able to, in the 3 years, really create a sustainable level of programming and partnerships within the community, people who, or organizations, different gyms and fitness centers that now have women-only hours with childcare that the women can go to. So that's been a really big thing for this research as well, as sort of challenging those systemic and structural issues. And we've seen, we're doing preliminary analysis now, and we've seen improvements in self-rated health status from baseline to 6 months. Some limitations that we've found in our research, and also just sort of working with this population as a whole, conventional measures are not necessarily appropriate for this population of women. So when we're looking at BMI, I mean, it's complicated looking at that during pregnancy and postpartum regardless, but then you add potential substance using. So oftentimes, when we're looking at weight loss as a positive thing, it oftentimes means that women may be substance using again. So we've really struggled with those measures. And for the weight gain and pregnancy stuff, we've looked at a lot of self-reported data, and I think 35% of the women don't actually remember how much weight they gained during their pregnancy, so there's some recall issues. And then compared to the India report card, we have quite a small sample size of 34 women, but again, for the purposes of this program, it seems to work.
Okay, yeah, we want to acknowledge our partners and our funders, and particularly all of the women who participate weekly in the group. Yeah, they make the dream happen.
And I just want to add here, so we have created a trauma and violence informed physical activity toolkit, and it's available at this really long and inconvenient website up here. So I'm happy to connect with anybody if they would like to access those tools.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. That was great. I can see the hard work there. My question is not so much research focused. What was the most surprising aspect of this work? What surprised you more than anything else?
For me, I think the level of interest from the women to be physically active, because this was my postdoc work, and so I went in thinking, oh, well, run some focus groups, see what the women want, and I didn't think there would be an interest because there's so many competing priorities like housing and food, and but I'm just really impressed with not only the level of interest, but the level of engagement that we've had. And then one more, I'll pass to you.
Yeah.
One more surprising thing is the barriers with accessing various community centers and organizations. We've struggled and spent hours trying to reach out to create space and room for the women, and we're surprised at the higher level barriers. So.
Yeah, and I would say the social cohesion or the friendships that have developed, we've seen. I've worked at Crabtree Corner for 4 years, and I've seen really, really unlikely friendships grow and sustain since then. And we're talking about kind of precarious parenting, and so the way they can role model parenting to each other has been really, really beautiful and really hard to capture, probably.
So my follow-up question would be, it's very interesting to see a trauma-informed intervention. If this had to be replicated in a population that is not as disadvantaged as the population you worked with, what would be the key recommendation? Because trauma affects all of us, and compliance is a big issue with interventions. What would your recommendation be? What's the most bang for the buck? As you know, resources are limited.
What do you think?
Do you want to go ahead?
I think probably pulling apart those 4 principles and really breaking it down. We were able to facilitate a training module-ish kind of to some local programmers, and a big part of that training was pulling those tenets out with some structural, more organizational level changes, and then individual changes for the facilitator, like the personal trainer or yoga instructor, etc.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that a trauma-informed approach should be created for this population in mind, but is applicable across the board. So it's relatively, it's just more challenging to get people to buy into the model.
And from a women-centered focus, childcare. Like if your kids can be on site or there's child minding on site, you're moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and one last thought, the level of discrimination that women experience. So like 90% of the women reported feeling discriminated against in the last 3 months. So the level of discrimination that these women are experiencing every day is so prevalent that I think challenging organizations to really shift the way that they engage with people when they're walking through the doors, sort of from the first person they see to the last person.
Yes? Sure, that'd be easier, yeah.
It's pretty crazy.
That was an excellent presentation, very inspirational. Something I reflect on a lot with regards to workplace wellness programs is there are some people who are easier to engage in physical activity than others for various reasons. And the challenge is always to get programs that everybody feels included in and wants to be involved in. Were there any individuals or subgroups that were more challenging to engage, and can you share any strategies that you used?
Sure. So because this is a community-based research approach, the women really led the charge in terms of what activities they wanted to do. So as Jessica mentioned, we have the sort of walking program is the real like heart of the intervention. But we have some women that, you know, we said we were doing non-contact boxing, and they said, I've just experienced so much violence, I can't believe you guys are offering boxing. Whereas other women, we've offered yoga, and they're like, yoga is so boring, I hate it, I don't want to focus on my breath, it triggers me. And so I think the way that we've dealt with that is that every month we offer 4 weeks of new programming. So we don't necessarily engage all of the women in each of the different programs, but we create programming that will eventually bring the women into something that they will like.
So if they're 4-week programs, then what would be the sustained approach then to continue the involvement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the sustainable piece is that, for example, the non-contact boxing, we offered that for 4 weeks, and the women loved it, and we supported the boxing club in obtaining funding to continue offering that. So they now offer that another day of the week. So essentially our goal is to have programming for every day of the week for women to drop into. So they offer that on like a day that we're not doing our programming. So they've been doing that now for 4 or 5 months. And we're, submitting for larger grants to support the other partners that we have as well in offering that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you.
Afternoon, I'm Chris Darroch from York University. It's my pleasure to now invite the next speaker, Joyla Furlano from Western University, to the podium. Joyla will be speaking about the effects of resistance training on cognitive function in sedentary and older adults with overweight.
All right. Hello, everyone. So thanks for being here. So my name is Joyla. I'm a first-year PhD student at Western University in the neuroscience program there. And today I'm going to be sharing with you my PhD work that I'm currently just starting. I've been at it for about 6 months now, so it's still a work in progress, but I'm looking at the effects of exercise in a specific population of older adults, so those that are at risk of diabetes and with that cognitive decline. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with diabetes, but just in case you're not, it's characterized as having high blood glucose levels, usually due to some lifestyle factor element. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about its prevalence because it is climbing pretty rapidly. So by the year 2050, we're expected to see about a 50% increase in type 2 diabetes worldwide compared to 2011, so pretty crazy high amounts. So over the last few decades, researchers have started to look more closely at what's going on in the brain in somebody that is diabetic. And what we do know now is that there's a loss of neuronal function, so cell death, and there's a weakening of synaptic connections within the brain. We see brain atrophy, so whole brain atrophy, as well as certain cortical and subcortical regions. And with this, there's experienced cognitive deficits. So especially memory, executive function. Memory seems to decline pretty early on in diabetes, and so this is a cognitive function that I'm focusing on mainly. So there are a lot of risk factors for type 2 diabetes. A few that I'm focusing on for the sake of my own work is aging. So we know that older adults are at higher risk for diabetes, for type 2 diabetes. High sedentary time or not being physically active, or with that just not meeting the guidelines for recommendations. And also high body mass index, so being overweight or obese. And so we know that type 2 diabetes is a progressive disease, and so what I'm interested in is looking at what we can do to intervene before the deficits that occur in type 2 diabetes are seen in this population. So research has already looked at older adults that are fairly inactive and are overweight, and we know that they do experience some cognitive deficits and brain deficits already, but to a lesser extent. So like I said, I want to try to determine what sort of lifestyle interventions we can do in this stage to prevent these deficits from worsening. So of course, we know that exercise has a lot of benefits on the body and the brain. Now, most exercise research in older adults looks at aerobic exercise, so cardiovascular exercise. The problem with this in a lot of older adult populations is that there's just a lot of older adults that can't perform aerobic exercise, so those with mobility impairments or some sort of physical limitations. And so resistance exercise is a convenient alternative for this. So most older adults can do at least some form of resistance exercise, and there's much less research on this type of exercise, so this is what I'm currently looking at. In addition to that, resistance exercise also has an additive benefit that aerobic exercise doesn't. So we've seen, especially in older adults that are fairly inactive, that through resistance exercise, there's an element of learning. So oftentimes they're learning new exercise protocols that they haven't done before, and this element of learning in itself has been shown to improve cognitive function. So there is this gap in the literature then, and this is the focus of my own work, looking at how resistance exercise can improve brain health in this at-risk population. And again, for the sake of my own research, I'm focusing on these 3 risk factors, clustering them as an at-risk group for diabetes. So overall, this is my study design. So it's a pilot study because this hasn't really been done in this population before. So we've recruited 20 older adults, which sounds like not a lot, but it was very difficult. It took us, I think, about 18 months. The person before me was also working on recruitment, so it's very challenging with this population. But the participants were aged 60 to 80. They were sedentary, so they couldn't have been active for at least 6 months prior to joining our study, and they had a BMI of over 25, equal to or greater than. So our participants were randomly assigned into one of our 2 groups. So our experimental group was our resistance exercise group, of course, and we had a stretching control group, which I'll go over in a moment in more detail. So our participants come into the lab 3 times a week for 6 months, and like many other exercise interventions, the length of each session is 60 minutes, including a warm-up and a cool-down, and we have them exercise in small groups as well. We have 3 time points where we do cognitive testing and physical testing. So we use a wide range of cognitive tests. Most of them are paper and pencil tests. Physical testing, we look at things like muscle strength, aerobic capacity. We take their glucose levels and things like that. Also things like gait and balance, since it is an older adult population. And then finally, we do MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging. This is done at the baseline, so 0 months, and at the end, 6 months. So we're using this, of course, to look at structural and functional brain changes. We don't do this at the 3-month mark because past research really hasn't shown improvements with only 3 months. So just to give you an idea of what the exercise groups actually look like. So on the left, we have our balance group, control group. So again, balance exercises, stretching, relaxation. Previous research hasn't shown benefits to cognition with this type of exercise protocol. So that's why they're our control group. And then our resistance group is doing a progressive resistance exercise training, meaning that the resistance load is increasing over time based on their performance. We target major muscle groups, so quadriceps, hamstrings, biceps, triceps, etc. And one great thing about our facility is that we have a very user-friendly equipment. So it's great for older adults. They come in and they simply have to load a card with their information. They take it to each of the machines, they put it in, and the machine does everything else for them. Loads the resistance, tells them how much to do and when to rest and things like that. So that's been very helpful for our population especially. Again, just to mention, the reason why we are including a control group here of just balance and stretching exercises is because we want to try to control for as many confounding variables such as socializing or committing to a program and that sort of thing. So just to give you a brief idea of what we do for assessment, so this is just an example of one of our tests. Again, I am focusing on memory because it seems to decline pretty early on in this population. But essentially, our participants view a series of images while they're in the MRI scanner of a face with a place, and their job is to, in the next set of pictures, tell me whether they have seen the photo or not. So the first photo, for example, they would have to say is different in the recognition phase. So our preliminary results, so I've analyzed 17 of my 20 participants. My last 3 are just finishing up, so I'm a few weeks shy, unfortunately, for that. But a few interesting things so far. So we're actually seeing opposite of what we expected to see. So we expected that our resistance exercise group would perform better. So in this graph, we're looking at something called D prime. So for the sake of my research, this is a value of their performance on that memory task that I just went over. So a higher D prime means that they did better on the memory task. So as you can see, the resistance exercise group did worse, actually over the 6 months. And then also surprising is that the balance and tone group, or the control group, did better after 6 months. So I'll go over potentially why that could be in a moment. Something else that I've looked at is total brain volume, because this has been shown to decrease in diabetes and prediabetes and obesity. And so we are seeing more expected results here. So we see an increase for the resistance exercise group for total brain volume. However, we do see a slight increase for the control group as well, which we didn't expect to see. And this is mainly because their exercises shouldn't actually be affecting their brain health, structure, and function. So there could be something going on there that has an additive benefit. And again, I'll just go over that in a moment. But mainly here we are seeing an improvement in resistance exercise. So that's a start. So a couple potential theories to why we're seeing these results so far. There's a lot more analysis ahead. So one of my theories is that there might be a socialization effect. So my control group, I've noticed, is socializing a lot more than my experimental group. I think this just is because of the protocol, how it's designed. So the balance and tone group, they get to chat more, they do everything as a group, whereas the resistance exercisers kind of go off to their own machines and do their own workout. And we know that socialization has its own benefits to cognition, so this could potentially be what is causing the control group to do well. In terms of the resistance exercise group not performing well in memory, particularly, I have noticed that they're not all reaching their target resistance, and this is mainly due to some physical impairments and injuries they've sustained outside of the program, and when they come into exercise, they're not able to reach their target resistance. Finally, adherence has been a little bit of an issue for my resistance group. They're not attending as often as my control group, so that could in itself have effects as well. So lastly, just very quickly, where we're headed. So again, there's a lot more analysis to do. I want to look more closely at certain regions. So the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus. I want to look at functional connectivity. So this is all MRI processing. And one thing I should mention is that we are trying to get feedback on the study design from these participants, because we do want to do a larger scale study in the future. So we'd like to get as much feedback from participants as we can to improve the study itself. And then finally, again, the goal of this research is to really determine what sort of exercise program could be implemented in this population to help prevent further decline or improve already existing decline in this population. So I apologize for going a few seconds over, but thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi. Hi, I'm Priya Manchu. I'm an endocrinologist in Victoria, and I really enjoyed hearing about your research. It's very applicable. The only thing is that you're using a machine to do resistance training that's, I don't know how available that is to older patients, whereas TheraBands are cheap, they're easy, people don't have to move somewhere. So how do you think that is going to impact the applicability or generalizability of the data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I didn't really mention is that they are doing other exercises outside of the machine. So they are using free weights. So they do things like mini lunges, mini lunge walks, mini squats. So that is why we implemented that. The reason that we are doing the machine protocol is because this exact protocol has been shown to improve cognition and brain health, what we're looking at in a similar population. So we wanted to first start with that to see if we'll see any improvements. And then what we wanted to do was work with that protocol, because there are some flaws to the protocol and some things I would personally like to improve. And so that's part of why we're getting the feedback from the participants. I want to take as much information as I can get from this study and try to improve it for older adults so that they could potentially do it on their own. There are a lot of other studies coming from Western right now that are looking at doing once a week exercise training in lab and then 2 at home. So there's definitely that push to make it more applicable. But just for the sake of our study, we just wanted to try to replicate previous findings the best we could in a different population. But for sure, that's definitely been feedback, because I have had I'd say a handful of my participants, after they finished the 6 months, were loving it and they wanted to come back. And actually, we've actually opened up our lab to be like a general gym now for older adults because they loved it so much. But yeah, that's definitely something that we have to consider going forward.
And just thank you for that explanation. And it's a very thoughtful design, clearly. The one other thing that I wondered about is when you actually start engaging people in physical activity, you may also be increasing the out of lab physical activity as well.
Yep.
How do you start capturing that?
Yeah, so we have them, so we give out a few handouts, a few questionnaires once a month.
Okay.
So one of them looks particularly at physical activity outside of the program. So it's a 4-page questionnaire, and it asks them from everything from light exercise or light physical activity. They've been instructed to not do any regular exercise, but I have noticed that a lot of older adults, after being in the study, want to even like walk more or just be outside more and do other things. So we do our best to take that into account by having them tell us. Again, it's, you know, it's their word. We have no way of measuring that, unfortunately. So yeah, but we do try to at least account for that by having them fill out a questionnaire once a month. I think in the future it might even be beneficial to do it more frequently because a month might be a long time for older adults to remember what they've been doing if they're doing activity every day. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Good. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah,
over
sorry,
this side.
I didn't see you.
That's okay. Just a quick thought. I'm not an expert in this field, but I've seen some work that suggests that that age group of adult maybe needs some protein supplementation to actually get fitter. And so just wondering if you've thought about controlling for food intake or looking at that. Okay.
Yeah, so it's not something that we've done in the pilot study, but there are other studies going on in the lab that do try to control for diet. It's really tricky, as you can imagine, especially in this type of population because they're going from, you know, doing no exercising, a very little physical activity to being in like this 3-week, 6-month program. So we decided that we weren't going to take diet into account. We do have them fill out a questionnaire once a month, similarly to their physical activity levels outside the program. So we try to document sort of their eating habits, but when we do a larger scale study, which is what we're aiming to do next year, I think we're gonna try to take diet into consideration. I'm not sure if we'll be able to control it or if we want to add in supplementation. But I guess it'll depend on the results from this study. But for sure, if we could, I mean, that obviously would be better, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next speaker is Dr. Karen Strange from Childhood Obesity Foundation. Dr. Strange will speak to us about implementation supports for childhood healthy weight, family-based healthy living program.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So as you heard, my name is Karen Strange, and I'm the project director for the Family Healthy Living Program. And today I'm going to talk to you about our analysis of the training and implementation support for the program during the pilot phase. I'd like to acknowledge that this program is delivered in partnership between the Childhood Obesity Foundation and the University of Victoria, and we are funded by the province of BC. So just to give you a little bit of background of how the program came about, in 2015, the BC's Continuum for the Prevention, Management, and Treatment of Health Issues related to overweight and obesity in children and youth, otherwise known as BC Healthy Weights Continuum, was released and is a guiding document for development of policy, programs, and services in BC. And it was identified that there is a gap in programs and services within the early intervention component. So this component really is intervening at an early stage before clinical management or clinical intervention is required. So Child Obesity Foundation was funded by the province to develop an early intervention program, which the working title is the Family Healthy Living Program. So this program is delivered in municipal recreation centers and YMCA facilities in BC. It is for families that have children between the ages of 8 and 12 and who have a BMI for age above the 85th percentile. It's a 10-week program that includes weekly group sessions as well as an online portal session. It includes at least 26 hours of contact hours with the families with the program. And there's also post-program support. So once they finish the 10 weeks, they have an additional 2 months where they receive support by the facilities, which includes bi-weekly sessions where they come together. So the topics that are addressed in the program include healthy eating, physical activity, screen time, sleep, and positive mental health. In terms of the staffing, staff roles within the program, centrally at COF we have myself as well as a program coordinator, and we support all the sites that are implementing the program. At the local sites, there are 4 members of the team. There's a program coordinator who is responsible basically for the administrative aspects, liaising with ourselves, being involved in the recruitment of families, making sure that rooms are booked, staff is hired, etc. And really integrating it into their program within their facility. And then we have 3 facilitators that actually deliver the program. So there's a group facilitator, a physical activity facilitator, and a program assistant. And then in terms of actually implementing the program, COF provides the sites with everything that they need. So that includes facilitator manuals, includes the facilitator's kit, that includes all the material that they need for delivering the physical activity component. So there's things in there such as playground balls, activity station ideas, bean bags and scarves, brain dance CD, skipping ropes, etc. So I think you probably get the idea. We also provide the parent binders and the children's binders already made up, so that has their handouts and their worksheets that they're going to work through during the course. We do provide the children with water bottles and pedometers, and we also provide 2 tablets per site. As I mentioned, there's an online component, so in case there's any families that don't have regular access to a device where they can get onto the online portion, we do provide 2 tablets that can be loaned out to those families. So all the facilitators participate in a 3-day workshop, and that was held for the pilot phase in September 2018. The workshop is designed to go over topics such as recruitment and promotion. So how do you promote the program within your community? We talk a lot about the scope of practice for the facilitators and staying particularly within their scope of practice. We talk about group facilitation, so both the theory of it, but we also provide them with opportunity to practice facilitating certain parts of the program. We talk about trauma-informed practice, so the presentation earlier was very in line with the way that we are going. We also have all the facilitators complete the Balanced View online module, which is on weight bias and weight stigma, which is a Provincial Health Services Authority module that was created. The training was designed and is delivered by a registered dietitian, a physical activity specialist, and a mental health specialist. And the training, beyond talking about group facilitation and trauma-informed practice, really focuses on the topics that the program is about. There's strong emphasis that it is not a weight loss program. It is about healthy behaviors, focusing again on healthy eating, physical activity, positive mental health, and sleep. And it's really about behavioral change skills and providing the families with a toolkit for themselves. So we had 11 programs total that ran over fall 2018 and winter 2019. We had a total of 59 children that were involved in the program, 55 parents, and in terms of site program leaders, we had 22. In terms of the program, families are recruited into the program through a number of different mechanisms: social media, referral from healthcare providers, displays at the recreation centers, as well as displays around the community. Our number one way of families finding their way to our program is through social media and Facebook in particular. So just focusing on the training for the facilitators, Again, we ran a 3-day workshop, and we did a pre and post workshop survey that had both Likert scale questions as well as open-ended questions. During the course of the 10 weeks, we asked the facilitators to complete weekly tracking forms, and then we also did post-program interviews. We did both quantitative and qualitative analysis. Our quantitative, we utilized SPSS, and for the qualitative, we used in vivo for our theming. So at the beginning of the workshop, we asked the participants what was their previous training in. A lot of the facilitators had quite a bit of training in physical activity and physical literacy, less so in healthy eating, and particularly in food literacy and food skills. A fair number had quite a bit in positive mental health, but again, less so in the trauma-informed practice, as well as non-judgmental practices and parenting practices. When we looked at their content confidence pre and post workshop, what we saw is that they increased their confidence in all of the areas, so in physical activity, the healthy eating areas, positive mental health, non-judgmental practices, trauma-informed practices, and parenting practices. In particular, we saw a pretty significant increase in the food literacy and food skills, as well as in the trauma-informed practices and the parenting practices. So what that said to us is that in terms of the content, we're hitting areas that they would like more support and training in, and align with the topics of the course or the program itself. And then we asked them more specifically about their teaching confidence in various areas. So again, at the conclusion of the 3-day workshop, they felt that they had increased their confidence in teaching and delivering physical activity and healthy eating, as well as providing support to the families. The fourth one, referral, is their confidence in being able to refer families out to other supports if needed. And as you can see, they didn't change too much there. And so for us, again, that's an indication that we need to work a little bit more on that in our workshops and our support of the facilitators themselves. Again, we asked them about the actual experience in participating in the workshop. Many of them identified that the content was somewhat new, and again, that reflects where we saw some changes in several areas, including food skills and food literacy, trauma-informed practice, etc. Overall, they were very satisfied both with the workshop content and the workshop delivery, and found that the training was quite useful. One of the things that we did during the workshop is, as I mentioned, we have 3 staff positions, physical activity and group leader. The group leader is really responsible for delivering the theory part around healthy eating, physical activity, etc. And we kept everyone together. And we felt that that was beneficial because even though the physical activity facilitator may not be delivering the group sessions, they still had a clear understanding of what was happening. And we had delivered previous programs, and one of the comments was we didn't really have the whole picture of the program because we didn't really know what was going on in that group session while we were with the children at the physical activity. So we made a conscious effort to keep everybody together through the entire 3 days. And some of the feedback we got was that they really appreciated that, really appreciated learning all the other aspects of the program. So we asked them what did they like the most. The healthy eating nutrition was definitely an area that they really appreciated learning more about, and the positive mental health. And having the opportunity to actually facilitate the physical activities. So if you remember back to the beginning, a lot of them had experience with physical activity and physical literacy, but we introduced them to some new aspects, new activities, and they got the opportunity to practice that, and they really appreciated that piece, as well as having the variety of facilitators. So again, that comment goes back to keeping everybody together and being able to interact and engage with all of the staff and facilitators that would be delivering the program. We asked them at the conclusion of the workshop what they felt would be the anticipated facilitators for delivering the program. So site-to-site communication tools, so being able to communicate with other facilitators within different communities, having the project coordinator as a point of contact and support, having a variety of activities to choose from. We built in a lot of flexibility into the program, the facilitator's manual itself, and having a positive environment. They felt would be facilitators. What they felt would probably be barriers were questions that they got outside their scope of practice, families not having enough time to commit to the program, keeping the participants motivated, and low participation numbers. We, as I mentioned, we asked them to complete weekly tracking forms, and as well we interviewed them at the conclusion of the 10-week program, and we asked them, well, now that you've implemented it, what were the barriers and facilitators? So certainly the facilitating factors, including the provision of the equipment, so they didn't have to go and look for it. It was right there in their facilitator kit. The training workshop itself, they felt was a facilitating factor and provided them with what they needed to implement the program. The manual, having experienced, passionate staff that was working on the program, they felt was very valuable and a facilitating factor. The support from the centralized team, and having supportive management staff within their recreation facility that saw the value in this program was a facilitating factor as well. Barriers was small group size, so groups were typically 5 to 6 families. If you have a week where attendance is low, that's often difficult with the group activities. Aligned with that was irregular attendance and a lot of content to complete within the weekly session. So just in terms of what the facilitators said in their own voice, a staff at a higher level who are passionate about this kind of program was a facilitator. Programs that align, or the program, sorry, aligns with the Recreation Center's values, working alongside passionate, experienced facilitators, and a strong belief in the program itself. And in terms of a barrier, attendance definitely was a struggle. It wasn't a barrier, but it caused implementation issues. And so in a lot of cases, the families were equally happy to be there on their own as they would be with other people. But from a facilitator's perspective, again, that's often very difficult when the activities are designed for a group itself. So we've learned a lot from implementing the pilot, and happy to say that we've got continued funding to continue this program and roll it out to more communities. So we will take what we've learned from the pilot in terms of the training that we provide and the support that we provide, and do some program improvement, quality improvement over the summer, and be back delivering programs again in the fall. So thank you, and I'll take some questions if there are any.
Great. Do we have any questions?
Hi, just Priya Andrew, I'm an endocrinologist in Victoria, and it's very interesting. So this is being funded by the Ministry of Health, the PHSA?
Ministry of Health, yes.
The Ministry of Health.
Yeah.
And is this something that they are going to be sustaining?
That is a great question. Right now, we have funding for another year. If they continue funding it after that, to be determined.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is more of a sort of, not quite a study as such, but more of a experience with the program, what the outcomes are before and after. Were those objectives that you had going into the project?
Yes, so our funding for the last 2 years was to develop and pilot the program.
Okay.
So we actually have a number of other presentations on the outcomes themselves of the program, at the conference.
Okay, and just finally, does the government, does the Ministry of Health see this as something that they would like to extend to other families or other communities, and how would they select, what sort of data do you think they're looking for as the sort of project director?
Mm-hmm. So they're definitely looking at reach, and part of the mandate for our new funding that we have is to target our outreach to underserved communities and those with higher Indigenous populations.
Good.
Yeah, so we're just determining how we're going to approach that. So as I mentioned, right now, or through the pilot phase, the program is delivered through YMCA facilities and municipal rec centers. And we know that some smaller communities don't have those facilities, so we'll be looking at different ways of the program being offered.
Those are often the communities in greater need. And then the final thing is that one of the interesting things about British Columbia is that so many communities are separated geographically by mountains and hills and water, and so it's really is hard to get that. And have you thought about a telemedicine type component to the program?
Yeah, so two things on that.
It might be
One, so
cheaper
we,
in some ways.
part of the program during the pilot phase is we developed an online portal, and so we are assessing the impact of that, and further research dollars are going to look at expanding that online portal. But the second thing is there actually is a telehealth program in BC, which is called HEAP-K, which is the Health Link Healthy Eating and Activity Program for Kids. And so that's accessible throughout BC and is teleconference coaching.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. This is really encouraging to see.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Darroch from Department of Biology from University of Ottawa. Darroch will speak to us about unhealthy food and beverage sponsorship within sports clubs in Ottawa.
Hello, everyone. My name is Odera Eke. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Ottawa, and I'll be presenting my thesis research project on the extent of unhealthy food and beverage sponsorship of children's sports clubs in Ottawa. I have no personal conflict of interest to declare. So approximately 1 in 3 children in Canada have excess weight or obesity, and obesity is an increased risk factor for heart disease, stroke, cancer, and premature death. Therefore, decreasing the prevalence of childhood obesity is very important. Children are frequently exposed to food and beverage marketing through media such as television, digital media, and in child settings like at schools. For example, children may view 3 to 7 food and beverage ads per hour on television. And the majority of these promoted products are not adhering to dietary guidelines. Evidence has shown a link between food and beverage marketing and childhood obesity. This is because it influences food preferences, food intake, and even parent purchases. Child-directed food and beverage products marketed are typically highly processed, nutrient-poor, and energy-dense. So what is Canada doing about this? Well, Bill S-228, or the Child Health Protection Act, would actually prohibit food and beverage marketing directed at children under the age of 13. So this will include media, digital media such as smartphone apps, and child settings such as at schools. The problem with this bill, however, is that it does not restrict food and beverage company sponsorship of children's sports clubs. And it is an important avenue that the food and beverage industry uses to target children while they're engaged in sports or in the community. And these include coupons, samples, branded merchandise such as logos on t-shirts, and even prizes. And again, this influences brand awareness and contributes to children's food preferences and poor eating habits, as previous research in Australia has shown. So our objectives for this research were first to identify and characterize the extent of children's sports club sponsorship in Ottawa, and 2, to determine the healthiness of these food and beverage sponsors. And the reason why this research is so important is that there's none in Canada that has actually evaluated and examined the extent of food and beverage sponsorship of children's sports clubs. And if you were to go into any field in, for instance, the Ottawa region, you would see Tim Hortons logos branded on children playing soccer. So the first thing that we did was determine the 5 most popular sports participated by children in Canada, and these were soccer, competitive swimming, ice hockey, basketball, and baseball. And then we identified all the sports clubs in Ottawa. So the first thing we did was we conducted an internet search methodology by Mayer et al. We looked at the National Sports Association websites, From there, we were able to identify any relevant regional sports association websites, and from all the regional sports association websites, we got web links for all the Ottawa sports clubs. And we also Googled for Ottawa club with a specific sport to make sure that there were no sports clubs in the Ottawa region that were missing. The data was collected between the months of September and December 2018, and all pages of the web, the club's websites were examined for the presence of sponsorship information, and this included any publications such as newsletters. So the data that we collected from each club website included all forms of club sponsorship, and then we looked at particularly food and beverage sponsorship. So within the food and beverage sponsors, we classified them based on their category, so whether it was a fast food restaurant, a non-fast food restaurant, a food and beverage manufacturer, or a food and beverage retailer or supermarket. We also further classified all restaurants based on their size, so whether it was a single restaurant, a small chain restaurant, and these would be restaurants that only have 20 or fewer locations in Ontario, and large chain restaurants, those included those that have 20 or more restaurants in Ontario. We also categorized all the food sponsors into two categories. So one would be healthy. These are food sponsors that promote products from grocery stores, farmer markets, sandwich outlets, and smoothie outlets. And then we classified food and beverage sponsors as less and least healthy if they promoted products from burger outlets, sit-down restaurants, coffee outlets, and pizza outlets. We analyzed all the data using SPSS, and we were able to compare the means and frequencies across all sports of the presence of total sponsorship, food and beverage sponsorship, the category of food and beverage sponsorship, so whether that was a fast food restaurant or non-fast food restaurant, the healthfulness categorization, again, that is whether the food sponsors were healthy or less and least healthy, and then the restaurant chain size, so again, your single, your small, and your large chain restaurants. So this is when things got really interesting. We were able to identify 70 sports clubs in the Ottawa region, and of these 70 sports clubs, we saw that 39% of them were being sponsored by at least one or more food and beverage companies. So if we were to rank these sports types by their number of food and beverage sponsors, we can see that in first place, it would go to soccer with 22% of its sports clubs being sponsored by a food and beverage company. In second place, ice hockey with 17% of its sports clubs being sponsored by at least one food or beverage company. And in third place would be competitive swimming with 12% of its sports clubs being sponsored by a food and beverage company. And again, this is an award that you wouldn't want to win. So of these 70 sports clubs, we identified 341 sponsors, and 16% of them were identified as being a food or beverage company. Further classifying these food and beverage sponsors, we actually see that 86% of all food and beverage sponsors promote less and least healthy food products. And classifying this even further, you can see that fast food restaurants account for 46% of all food and beverage sponsors, while non-fast food restaurants, 30% of them are 30% of all the food and beverage sponsors are non-fast food restaurants. Looking at the companies that most frequently sponsor children's sports clubs, we see that the top three, again, following in line with fast food restaurants most frequently sponsoring, are Tim Hortons, McDonald's, and Boston Pizza. And of these 9 most frequently sponsoring companies, Foodline and Pita Pit are the only ones that we can consider as healthy. So this study was the first in Canada to really examine the extent of sponsorship in children's sports clubs, and we were able to look at all the sports clubs in the Ottawa region. However, because we were only looking at Ottawa, the results are not generalizable to areas outside of Ottawa. In addition, the healthfulness categorization poses a challenge, as it's hard to determine the nutrition value of food sponsors that are associated with a large variety of food products. And sponsorship on websites may not be up to date or complete, and therefore we need to do replicate studies and conduct interviews to make the results more robust. So overall, what we saw based on this study was that food and beverage sponsorship of children's sports clubs is frequent, with 39% of all clubs in the Ottawa region being sponsored by at least one or more food and beverage companies. 86% of all food and beverage sponsors promote foods that are less and least healthy. and fast food and non-fast food restaurants are the most common type of sponsorship. So what does this mean in Canada? Well, what we see is that children are being exposed to food and beverage marketing. For a child participating in soccer, let's say, they have one practice and one game a week, and at these games and practices, they're definitely being exposed to a large variety of mostly unhealthy food and beverage sponsors. Therefore, new regulations on food and beverage marketing restrictions need to include sponsorship of children's sports clubs. I would like to thank Dr. Monique Potvin-Kent and Elise Pauzet for all their help and contributions during this research project, and I'd like to thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
While we're waiting for questions, I'll just ask whether or not there was any sense of whether there were any of the sports clubs that voluntarily adopted sponsorship guidelines. Were you able to evaluate that at all?
We did collect data on whether they do have sponsorship guidelines, but from what I saw, it wasn't very clear exactly what they were looking for in regards to sponsorship.
Just a quick question. I'm interested to know, are you aware of any studies that looks at if they're wearing the Tim Hortons logo on their soccer uniform, for example, does that translate into them frequenting a Tim Hortons more often, or are you aware of anything? Because I think there's this, the kids forget what they're wearing on their jersey. So I'm just interested, are you aware of any studies that talk about that translating to actually going to a Tim Hortons franchise, as an example?
I'm not aware of specifically going to the Tim Hortons or any restaurant that's sponsored, but there are studies in Australia and in New Zealand that have looked at the impact of food and beverage company sponsorship and children's preferences for those specific companies that are sponsoring, and their ability for brand recall in those specific products, and it's pretty high. Yeah.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Lana Vanderlee from the University of Waterloo. And I was just wondering if you've given any thought, I thought it was interesting when you talked about sort of healthy and unhealthy food establishments, and talking about like sandwiches as being healthy and coffee shops as being less healthy. And do you have any thoughts on just how that categorization might affect, some of your conclusions? Because to me, I might think that, some sandwiches are healthy and some have tons and tons of calories. Some pitas are healthier and some are less healthy. And so just wondering if you've thought about how you might categorize those restaurants.
Thank you for your question. Yes, that was definitely a challenge with this. However, we did use the nutrient profile by Prowse et al., and that's the way that they classified. They did a study in Australia, and that's how they were able to classify between whether a food was healthy or less and least healthy. So we kind of just followed that.
Okay, and does that look at all of the pitas within pitas, or is it just sort of overall product offerings? Just totally curious.
It's pretty much overall product.
Okay, thank you.
I am Dr. Nadine Roy. I'm a family physician from New Brunswick. My kids swim on a competitive team. And what I've noticed is that sometimes, there's not always sponsorship on the website, but it's at the competitive events themselves that they are given the winner of a swim will be given a free pizza at Papa John's, or there's chocolate milk on the side of the pool for the swimmers. Have you looked at or thought about looking at the competitive events themselves to see how much sponsorship there's there? Because in my opinion, I think that there might be more.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely going to the events themselves would be very beneficial. We only looked at websites based on the scope of this study, but definitely I believe that further area of research definitely should look at the actual events and the actual competitions. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, can I ask if Mina Saad is here? Great. Okay. So Mina's our last speaker from Memorial University. He will be speaking to us about explicit and implicit weight bias attitudes among medical students.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Mina, and I am a first-year medical student at Memorial University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about explicit and implicit weight bias attitudes among medical students. So, obesity is a chronic illness that is very prevalent across Canada, particularly in the Atlantic provinces, and in Newfoundland and Labrador in particular. And in addition to the health complications associated with this disease, people with obesity are frequent targets of prejudice and discrimination due to the weight biases that exist in our society, especially among medical doctors. And as an example, one study conducted in the States found that more than 50% of primary care physicians view patients with obesity as ugly, unattractive, awkward, and non-compliant. And of course, people with obesity can perceive these weight biases and are therefore they're more likely to avoid or delay healthcare visits. And there is evidence from the Canadian literature to indicate that women with obesity are significantly less likely to get the recommended gynecological screening tests relative to normal weight women due to that fear of discrimination. And the discrimination is so profound that it prompted a Canadian woman recently to request in her obituary that medical professionals stop fat shaming. So it's clear that interventions need to be in place to target the weight biases that exist in our society. And medical students are a suitable target population for this because, one, they represent the future of the medical profession, but also we are in the early stages of our medical curriculum, and interventions could have long-lasting impact into the future. So I conducted a literature review with the hypothesis that medical students do exhibit explicit, which are conscious, and implicit, unconscious, weight bias attitudes. And I had 3 objectives in particular. One, I wanted to investigate explicit and implicit weight bias attitudes in pre-clerkship students. Then I wanted to see how those weight bias attitudes would progress throughout the 4-year medical curriculum. And finally, I wanted to see if these weight biases do exist, would they manifest during real-life clinical encounters? So this highlights the methods. Our only exclusion criteria was studies prior to 2005. And we ended up getting a total of 11 studies. And interestingly, all of them were conducted in the States. So to address the first objective, weight biases among pre-clerkship students, all the studies that I found, this indicated that medical students display explicit and implicit weight bias attitudes. And the most convincing evidence came from a very large national study conducted in the States where they looked at 4,732 first-year medical students across 49 medical schools. And as you can see in the graph, most students exhibited a strong implicit and explicit weight bias attitudes. And the explicit attitudes were very profound that 16% of students checked off the box, I don't like fat people very much. So then next, I wanted to see how these weight biases progress or change throughout the 4-year medical curriculum. And this is very nicely highlighted in this study, where they looked at weight bias attitudes in first-year medical students, and then again at the end of the 4th year of their medical program. And as you can see, the graph on the right, which highlights explicit weight bias attitudes in the dashed lines, they went up. Whereas on the left, the implicit weight biases went down, but students still exhibited implicit weight biases, right? So the authors then wanted to see what variables predicted or were correlated with the explicit and implicit weight biases. And explicit weight biases, an increase of it was associated with observed discrimination / negative comments about patients with obesity by the faculty, whereas the decrease in explicit biases was associated with favorable interaction with patients with obesity and skills in providing weight loss counseling to patients with obesity. For implicit weight biases, an increase was associated with hours of training in dealing with difficult patients and observed discrimination / negative comments by faculty. A decrease in implicit weight biases, though, was also associated with favorable interactions with patients with obesity. So the studies that look at explicit and implicit weight biases tell us that, so far, that medical students do have weight biases, but they don't necessarily predict whether these biases would manifest during clinical encounters. So virtual reality studies can investigate this by establishing an environment standardized for confounding variables and observing the behavior and attitudes of medical students. So one study got 3rd and 4th year medical students, and they randomly assigned them to interview a female patient who was either normal weight or with obesity, and the patient presented with 2 weight-related complaints and 1 regular complaint. And the results of the post-interview questionnaire indicated that the medical students who interviewed the virtual patient with obesity perceived them to be less healthy, less likely to adhere to medical advice, and more responsible for causing the weight-related complaints. Also, the optical tracking device in the headset showed that medical students engage in less eye contact with the patient with obesity, which could possibly indicate a lack of empathy in the dialogue. With that being said, though, there was no evidence that students exhibited a weight bias with regards to clinical recommendation and ordering of diagnostic tests. So another study also looked at first-year medical students, and they randomly divided them into 4 groups. They made them watch a scripted 5-minute interview between an empathetic male physician and 1 of 4 female patients with diabetes. And as you can see, that's how they looked. They were avatars. And the patients varied with respect to weight and skin color. And the results indicated that medical students do possess a weight bias, but this weight bias was particularly pronounced against the white women as they rated the avatar as most sloppy, non-compliant, lazy, unattractive, and ugly. So based on this lit review, I could conclude 3 things from it. Medical students do exhibit explicit and implicit weight biases during the early stages of the medical school. These weight biases do persist throughout the 4-year medical education, and weight biases can manifest during clinical encounters. So, of course, identifying weight biases among future health professionals is a very important step in advocating for improved quality and accessibility to healthcare services for people with obesity. And so, I plan for my medical school research project to conduct the first study that investigates weight biases among Canadian medical students. And I hope to come back next year to share with you the data from this result and from the study. And I do believe that it is an important component to the puzzle in developing interventions and curricular changes to target weight biases in the future. Here are my references. Thank you.
Denis Prudhomme, clinicians, Ottawa and Institut Montreal. Thank you for your excellent presentations to share this sad story, because it's really a sad story. And one thing that came to mind when you present your result was I was looking the size of the candidate that are admitted in our medical school. And I'm not so sure that our clinical school new candidate represent the size of the population, meaning that even at the interview, they must be, or maybe they have a bias in terms of how we grade students. And have you crossed some study about the prevalence, for example, of obesity, overweight among first-year medical students? because that's start there. The other point that you seem there is a bias in what you have also present is not your, but the literature is most of the testing had been using male medical students evaluate female evaluate student. And there is no data on women medical student evaluating either female or male. And lastly, is there any adjustment for, let's say, a male obese medical student evaluating an obese patient? Do they have the same?
Oh, yeah. So for sex differences, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I didn't come across that, to be honest. They didn't, in the results section, they didn't reflect the differences, sex differences. But no, I didn't come across that at all.
And no study that evaluate the perceptions of women medical students evaluating obese patients?
Like
because most of all the study you present was using male evaluating female patients.
Which study in particular? All of them, you mean?
Well, most of the study you have present, they're all the same. In the virtual reality is always male evaluating female women.
No, there were both males and females.
Both male and female?
Yes, yes.
And no difference between
No,
sex?
none were reported, at least in the studies.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up to that. So, so how important do you think it is that the majority of the studies that you saw were dealing with first-year students? Is that by intention, or do you think, is that where you see your work going?
So no, actually, most studies looked at, so the studies that I came across, half looked at first and second year medical students, the other half looked at third and fourth year. But what I did in this presentation is I highlighted first years, and then I tried to just demonstrate the trend, the change over the 4 years. But yeah, that is where I see myself going, trying to identify the early biases during the first and second year, and then trying then to investigate what interventions can be in place into the program, and then evaluating the third and fourth years afterwards.
So I know this is a bit of a leading question for the future, for the first study that's being done, but in terms of the future directions, do you see this as being something focused, you know, if you're trying to infiltrate the community of new trainees, is this something that has to happen at the level of CMA or the individual faculties of medicine at the universities, or what do you see the level of intervention, I guess, ultimately?
The intervention?
Yes,
I see what you mean. What I'm aiming for right now is at a faculty level. So trying to, you know, every single medical school across the country, it's different, you know, geographical differences, and they have their own unique culture. So what we're trying to do is, first off, identify whether those biases do exist in Canada, and I'm assuming they do. Afterwards, we will conduct a literature review and then propose various interventions that could be in place, but it's ultimately up to the medical school themselves to decide how to incorporate it.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, just, hi, I'm Priya Manju. I'm an endocrinologist from Victoria. So one of the things that really struck me about your presentation was that one of the sources of implicit bias was the exposure of students to negative comments from or negative impressions from their attending physicians, from their teachers. And that has far-reaching implications. If someone is going to be the faculty or the people that are involved in selecting students, so if it's if they have an implicit bias with patients, then that certainly would affect selection of medical students. And so you get this sort of, potentially, this propagation of the bias. So it's brought the attention to a number of things, a number of root causes of where we start seeing the weight bias and where it grows from. And I think I would argue that that that's something that needs to be addressed, probably at a curriculum level, and perhaps someone needs to look at the presence of weight bias in the interview process, in the selection of candidates for med school.
Yeah.
What do you think? Has that come up in your discussions?
So trying to basically look at candidates who are applying to medical school, their weight biases that early on?
Yeah, I think from what you're saying, that's the implicit assumption that if someone's going to express bias against patients with obesity, then that's likely to occur for candidates who are applying to medical school.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think we all have an implicit bias, right? So the biggest thing about implicit bias is not to identify people and label them. You know, it's more so, even if you are a medical student and you do have an implicit bias, the big thing is having an open mind and being willing to address it, identify it first, and then address it through, you know, self-reflection, or that seems to be the most successful intervention, at least up to this point. But I don't think that labeling people that early on and then determining their acceptance into medical school is the answer to eliminating that weight bias.
No, but it's important to know that it's there, for example. So if you have someone that's selecting students and they have an implicit bias against persons with obesity, then you start getting that propagation, because then they're selecting people who are, and I'm not saying that we want to label it. I think it's important to know the extent of the problem, the reach of the problem, and where it starts, because the way to address it is through education. That's all. It's not labeling it. It's not berating. It's just through education. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. Absolutely. Good point. Thank you.
So on behalf of my co-chair, and I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance and thank our presenters for some outstanding presentations. And just a reminder before we close that for those of you who have them, to fill out the evaluation forms. Okay, have a great afternoon.
You can read that.
That's fine. It's the only thing. Oh, sorry.
Tev, can you kill us for a sec?